My mother was dying, and my girlfriend took that opportunity to cheat on me with a random guy who recently joined her group of friends, because she knew I would be distracted with my mother's death. I was the one who found out about them, and I saw it with my own eyes, but they didn't see me. So I decided to come up with a plan to literally destroy their lives permanently, and do it in a way that they would never know I was the one behind it. This is what happened before I continue. Remember to subscribe to the Forbidden Stories channel, and activate the little bell so you don't miss future updates. I will have to reveal and admit some things about myself that I wouldn't like, and I'm not proud of. If you hate reading, then don't even continue. My story is horrible, unfortunately, and I wouldn't wish my life on anyone, not even the ones I chose to seek revenge on. When I was 18, my father suffered a debilitating stroke and was unable to work or drive again. I volunteered to take care of him since my mother had a job full-time, and my family needed her to keep working a year after her stroke. She passed away after enduring a triple bypass. I lost it, and that changed something inside me. I had lived a somewhat sheltered life due to regularly attending church and church activities. When my father died, if I wanted to go to college, I would have to pay for it out of my pocket. I was not eligible for any loans, if you think about it almost. It was a stroke of luck. I got a menial job and started partying at 19, having never tried alcohol or illegal substances, or ever having done the deed before. I had been very shy in my teens, as I was a very late bloomer, and always looked several years younger than my. At a party one night, I met a guy several years older than me. We'll call him Benji. He asked me to come over after my shift at my terrible minimum wage job the next day. I agreed, and when I arrived he drove me to his house where two of his friends were busy snorting dust. White leaning on a table, I had seen illegal substances in movies, so I assumed it was cocaine. They offered me a line and laughed at my refusal to try it. Benji explained to me that the reason he invited me was that even though I was 19, I could pass myself off as a high school student. He explained to me that they sold these drugs and they had other kids working to distribute them to schools. They wanted me to go to each high school on campus every day and collect cash, while other kids would drop off bags of pre-weighed cocaine. They would buy packs of cigarettes and put the drug with a small initial on the bottom indicating which school it had to be delivered to. They had gotten a cellophane wrapping machine that is called, and it shrank the plastic. Everything worked fine as planned for years. It was surprising to know how many police officers, lawyers, and even judges were involved in my dealings, consuming themselves or their children for something that would have guaranteed me a long stint in prison. However, I never got caught. I quit my stupid job and went to work for Benji every day. If I wasn't delivering whey in Benji, and his friends taught me how to hit the punching bag workout, or fight. They had built a full-sized boxing ring in the back because they loved to fight. They had taken me in as a buddy as I grew up. Although I had grown another 3 inches in height after high school, to be 5'7", I was still unfair and not very strong. Benji was several years older than me and had been stationed in South Korea for many years. There he was able to learn a form of martial arts known as subak, but he had also been a boxer as well. The 3 boys loved teaching me how to drive and fight. They enjoyed teaching me new moves and watching me learn so quickly. This was never to attack anyone, it was strictly self-defense. They wanted to be sure I could protect myself if something bad happened, and they wanted me to be able to, that I had their backs. Benji made me carry a loaded 9mm. Whenever we drove, he carried a huge revolver by time. I was in college and had started selling to classmates. My mother was proud that I was paying my own tuition and books. She never asked how if there are some people, although very few, who use the money earned from unsavory deeds to improve their lives. As there are some guts who use that money to pay for their studies or help at home, it is rare. But it happens. What my mother never knew was the fact that I made more money in a week selling these substances than she as a teacher in a whole month. I drove an old Camry, I never bought flashy clothes, or I threw money away to impress anyone. I kept a profile as low as I could. I finished my degree in 3 years because I had a lot of free time. I initially wanted to be a lawyer, but I had met too many corrupt police officers and judges. I studied law without the goal of trying out for the bar, because I wanted to become a jury consultant. For those who don't know what it's like, when a law firm has a client they are defending, they send out a list of potential jurors who will be involved in the trial, and they try to study the personality and background of each juror, so that the lawyer, before entering the room, can get to know them in advance and manipulate them. To convince them, my job was to take each name and investigate any background I could find. The firm I worked for decided what was important information for each particular case. The firm I work for is held in the highest regard in my field. I can research a lot of information about people legally through something as simple as a legal data site. In the recent past, I reconnected with a friend from school. Her name is Zaina. And I found out that she and I didn't know we were in love with each other, but we had both been too shy to say a word. There are more details, but suffice it to say I became best friends, fell head over heels in love, and planned a future together. Our previous 2 relationships had been disasters. Mine in particular had left me feeling totally worthless and incapable of love. I hadn't dated anyone in years. My previous ex, we'll call her Allison, had done horrible things to cause our breakup. I rescued her from a toxic relationship. I never abused her, and I let her know that no human deserves to be abused when she stabbed me in the back and left me. My life was in total ruin. Finding Zaina not only gave me hope, but made me realize that all relationships before her had been worthless. Zaina was the love of my life. We were meant to be together, and we finally were, sadly. 5 years ago. I woke up in bed to find Zaina was not by my side. I thought nothing of it until I walked into the laundry room and found her face down on the floor when I picked her up. Even before I turned her over, I knew something was wrong. Her body was completely stiff. When I turned her over, I realized she was dead. Rigor mortis had already set in and her face was frozen in the most painful expression of agony. You can imagine I called 911. Even though I knew she was already dead, I don't want to go into details about that night. Suffice it to say, the cops suspected I had done something, or she had overdosed for 5 hours. The detectives went through everything we had. I was repeatedly questioned with the same questions by multiple cops, all while I tried to comfort her mother as her only daughter had just died the next day. I accompanied Zaina's mother. Zaina had epilepsy, and her doctor suspected she might have died from sudden unexpected death. Due to epilepsy, none of us had ever heard of such a thing. Months later, when the autopsy came, this was the cause of death. The days that followed were a mix of tears of misery and disbelief. Nothing is enough to express how I felt from that moment on. For many months, I'm not going to lie. There were many moments when I thought and even planned to end my life. I knew Zaina would want me to live, and after seeing how the loss of a son had shattered her mother, I couldn't do that to my own mother. I managed to face the future, just by focusing on my mother, who was getting older. I closed myself off from all friends and family. It was hard enough to have the strength to keep my job and take care of my mother. I exercised every day, and so to cycle for cardio. I took some Krav Maga classes to ease the stress, but I never even thought about dating someone, and frankly, the idea seemed pointless. Zaina was really a special person with a beautiful soul. I knew I could never have that kind of relationship with someone ever again. Eventually 2 years went by, and I met a woman we will call Angie. Initially, we started hanging out as friends, like what I needed most of the time. But as I opened up about what happened with Allison, and then Zaina, we grew closer, and Angel seemed to empathize. We started sleeping together and eventually became a couple. I still had to keep some of the attention on my mother. Even though I enjoyed my time with Angie, she seemed to appreciate it. I listened. He talked honestly and was protective of her. He said he loved me, and I admitted that I loved her. He loved me, and I admitted that I loved her. I never told her a word about how I had paid for college or the things I had seen or done. Zaina had, and she loved me, despite everything. While I knew I would never be what Zaina and I had, I never said or hinted at that to Angel. My mother's need for assistance was quite getting worse. Angel knew what I had suffered from the loss of Zaina, and seemed to understand the responsibility he had, caring for my mother. Angie and I had been in a monogamous relationship for over a year when my mother had to have some medical tests. My mother had a failing heart valve. Tests were done to determine if she could have a fix. A week later, we got good news. The valve could be replaced. But we also got devastating news. While tests were being done, they discovered 4 small masses around her right kidney. The chances were high that the masses were tumors and malignant. The doctors did a biopsy to find out she did in fact have kidney cancer. Kidney. My mother started chemo. and I knew my focus needed to be on being with my mother. Things had been good with Angel. We were planning to move in together. She lived in a town about 30 miles from me when I told Angel about my mother. She seemed deeply concerned, and when I explained we would be seeing less of each other, she assured me she had no desire to make things difficult between us. She said she wanted to be there for me, even if it was just as emotional support. I in fact urged Angie that if she decided she wanted to take a break or thought she might be interested in someone she knew to tell me, and I would understand. She assured me that she appreciated me in her life and that no one could take my place in her life. Initially, the chemo seemed to have none of the horrible side effects in her second month before she started noticing weakness and loss of appetite. I talked to Angie and texted her several times every day. She told me she would text me asking how my mom was doing as soon as she woke up, and we would often spend hours before falling asleep, talking and telling each other how much we missed each other. We would spend the night together about every other week. But everything seemed fine at that point. My mom's condition started to get worse. So I told Angel that she should go out with her friends and enjoy life as summer started. Angel would enjoy going to outdoor activities. Even without me, my mom's failing health meant there would be no fun for me. Angel would go out with friends, and I enjoyed hearing about the silly things she and her friends did. I was really glad that she wasn't locked in herself because of the problems in my life. She would always express her concern and sadness whenever I told her what was happening to my mom. The chemotherapy was killing the cancer cells, yet she kept getting older and frailer. I realized that the cancer was no longer killing my mother, but the medicine had to take a break. So a group of ladies from my mother's church came to sit with her for some free time on my own. I called Angie as I approached her town. She gave me the address of where she and her friends were, so I could go when I arrived. I saw most of her friends that I had already met in another part of the house on the back deck. I saw a guy sitting very close to Angie. The two of them were laughing. She introduced me as her boyfriend to the guy and shook my hand, insisting that he was glad to meet me. I was cordial with him. I don't think Ange suspected that I immediately felt that something was wrong. But the truth is that as soon as I met Will, I knew that this person, he had something that is a little weird to explain. Maybe it's because of my own criminal activity. I knew that Will was new to her group of friends, none of them, including Angel. I had known him until a couple of months ago. I need to be clear. Now. I know that what I felt at that moment was real. Angel had a lot of male friends, all of whom I genuinely liked. But there was something I sensed about Will that made me a little skeptical of his character. I did my best to cover it up so no one would notice anything. I started talking to Angel and his friends, trying to put my mind in Will's mind. I monitored Will from afar and connected with him. I interacted with him cordially. Angie. And I spent the night at his house before I had to leave to go home for the next few weeks. My mother's condition began to worsen. But Angie and I would talk and text all day, every day in retrospect. Now I realize that I initiated most of our conversation, but at the time I didn't keep track. One day some relatives offered to take care of my mother and give me a break. I went to see Angel, calling her on the way. She told me what restaurant she and her friends were going to have dinner at, so I headed there. When I got there, I saw Will Sally in a late model black Mustang. Although he didn't see me since he didn't know my car, I headed inside where Angie and her friends greeted me with hugs and words of sympathy and encouragement, a dinner and a few drinks. Before Angie and I returned to her house before we went to bed, I casually asked why Will had left before greeting me, and she told me she had no idea Will had been at the restaurant. The place we ate at was in the mall next to several other businesses. I thought maybe he had left one of those stores and my Angel, nor his friends, had seen him anyway. I stayed with her again. That night before I returned to my home at noon the next day. My mother had become very ill and had to be taken to the hospital via ambulance. She had pneumonia and was extremely weak. Due to chemotherapy and susceptible to many illnesses for 3 weeks, she was hospitalized. They gave her many medications through the vein, but her condition was getting worse every day, and the doctors informed me that she had at most a week to live. I knew that she would not want to leave this earth in that hospital room. So the staff made arrangements for her to be brought home and to help me make her last days as peaceful as possible when everything was prepared. We took my mother home. Although extremely weak, she was glad to see her home in a familiar environment. We both knew she did not have much longer to live. Although I was a little scared, she also told me that she was ready to go see my father once again. After so long, I got one of my cousins to take care of my mother for a few hours. I got in my car and I drove to see Angel without calling. I hadn't called because I was crying so hard at my mother's impending passing. I wouldn't have been able to talk when I got to Angel's house, and a black Mustang parked in her driveway behind her car. I thought nothing of it as I was so focused on losing my mother. Soon, I used the key she had given me to enter through the kitchen like we always did as soon as the door opened. I heard loud music, but I didn't suspect anything. I didn't see anyone in the living room, in the family room, or on the back deck down the hall to her bedroom, and noises coming from inside the door. I stopped and realized the sounds I heard were moans. My heart sank even further, and I stopped as I saw the sounds I heard were intimate. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Her bathroom was connected to a guest room with a bathroom with you. I walked quietly and slipped into the unlit bathroom and found her bedroom door open. I stopped dry seeing them. She was sucking his tool, and he was pulling her violently by the hair. My first instinct was to run full speed and slam his skull into my knee. But I knew I had to stay out of trouble for the sake of my mother and my job, so I walked away slowly, shaking with rage. I went back through the guest room to get out of the house and went to my car. They hadn't seen me. I sat in the car crying. A half hour later, I started the car and drove to my mother's house. I didn't tell anyone what I had just seen. Everyone assumed my tears were regarding my mother, which of course they were partially. But the betrayal I had just seen was something so sadistic. My mind knew that my mother was my priority, especially so close to the end. However, I felt so deceived by Angie. I felt like I had never known before, and I had felt so much rage in my life. Believe me, I thought about calling Angie, letting her know what I had seen, and curse her. But I knew, if she didn't care enough to make me faithful while my mother was on her deathbed, a few insults wouldn't bother her. I made sure my mother was comfortable and went to try and sleep in my old childhood room. I cried. I fell asleep. I woke up crying and cried some more throughout the night. I woke up to my cell phone ringing and saw it was Angel. I ignored the call and the urge to slam the phone against the wall. I went in to check on my mother. She was in a deep sleep due to the morphine sulfate she had been given. I managed to text Angel. I was very busy with my mother and would call her later after forcing me to eat food I didn't want. And taking up the fight, the hospice nurses came to take care of my mother after checking her vitals. They sadly informed me that my mother would die in 48 hours. I thanked them and walked out into the backyard, trying not to completely lose my mind with everything that had happened and was about to happen. I managed to text Angie and told her that my mother's condition was terminal, that I didn't want to see her. I didn't want to talk to her, and I didn't want her to show up. I owed it to my mother to do everything I could to make sure her last moments were as peaceful as I could. The next afternoon, just before 4 p.m. My mother took her last breath with me by her side, holding her hand as her life expired. The next 3 days, I was meeting with her pastor and putting the finishing touches on the church and the burial service. But I couldn't forget the images of Angie and fornicating in front of me. I never thought about it anymore. I got angry. I was mad at Angel, furious. But remembering how Will had been so overly friendly towards me made my blood boil even more. So if they hadn't already been intimate. When I first met him, they were on the cusp of it. That made me want to check who this guy was in my database. I hadn't checked before because I wanted to trust Angie and her decision-making. But I had sensed it from the moment I met him. I was actually mad at myself for ignoring my instincts. I didn't know anything more than his first and last name, and I had a hard time spelling it correctly. When I finally got it, a link popped up, which I opened to see an old picture of Will's face from many years before he had done some despicable things in my life. I've known people who have done horrible things intentionally and under the influence of various substances, but this man had a rap sheet for a variety of crimes, receiving stolen property, breaking and entering, and drug arrests. I scrolled down through his record of remains, went back further. I found out he had been paroled out of jail early about 2 years ago, after serving 9 years in prison, when I saw the charges that included exploitation of a minor and several other crimes of a similar nature. I admit I was disgusted Ange had betrayed me, which hurt me quite a bit. But knowing that she was sucking the dick of a demon fresh out of jail on the saddest day of my life made me feel physically sick. I doubted Angie had any idea who she was involved with behind my back. She had a naive and trusting nature that had gotten her into trouble before, but never like this. I had no doubt that anyone who knew Will's history would have considered him a vile creature, who should never have been released. But at that moment, I had to concentrate on my mother's funeral. I had to pull myself together by the time her funeral was over. Everyone was gone. I was mentally exhausted. As I laid my head on the pillow and tried to get some sleep, it just didn't quite fit in this story. I know it sounds a little psychotic, but I kept going all the night in Vela rereading Will's history. I wanted to know more about the person who had done so much harm to me in one of his most serious crimes. I found the names of 2 accomplices, AM and PG. I couldn't believe it. I was hallucinating. I thought it could be the result of so many hours awake and the shock. But the initials matched the name and surname of Angel. At that moment, a light bulb went on in my head and everything began to fit. I hurried to look for the name, and in my database, sure enough, there were all charges for consumption and trafficking of substances, and the most important thing was that he was an accomplice to 2 kidnappings with abuse of 2 children, but due to lack of evidence and claiming a mental illness, he was able to get out of jail. Just at that moment when it was beginning to dawn, I received a call from Angel. I didn't know what to do after everything I had discovered from all night without sleeping, and my state of shock. It was not the best option to pick up the phone, but I did it anyway. Angel told me he was going to. I came to the city for some work, and if we could spend the afternoon together. Her tone of voice seemed a bit strange and hesitant. She didn't seem sincere. However, she didn't know anything about my discoveries. Nor had I told her about my mother's death. I told her that it would be great to spend the afternoon together. That it would be good for me to clear my head. It was 7 in the morning. That left me about 8 hours to finish my investigation and draw up a plan for my revenge. I hung up the phone and went back to my computer. I continued to look into her background, comparing the data with some news from the newspaper about events that had occurred in her city related to the kidnapping of minors. I investigated her social networks and discovered that all the photos prior to the last 2 years were deleted. However, I found a mutual friend who did have. I saw photos from 10 years ago, where Angie and Will appeared as a couple. This Harpy had been lying to me all the time. Not only did she know Will, he was her ex-boyfriend. I could see how during their relationship, there were 12 disappearances of minors in their area, many more than normal. However, the bodies were never found. This had stopped being something personal. Now the anger I had inside no longer had anything to do with what they had done to me. Suddenly something in my heart finally broke. I realized that I had nothing anymore. All the people who one day here had died. Now I only had one goal complete. My revenge, give some peace to all the people who suffered because of them, and finish off these 2 monsters. I didn't need to read more. Time was flying, and I only had 5 hours to draw up my plan before seeing Angel. I needed to call Benji. He was the only person who could help me. I quickly told him everything that had happened, and the situation I was in. He told me that if I wanted, he could call a friend who is an expert hacker and infect Angie's phone with a little luck. We could listen to some information and locate her, while we thought about what to do. So we did in 20 minutes. I had full access to her phone, and the first thing I could see is that she had lied to me. The location of the cell phone said that she was at home. Just at that moment, a call came in on Angie's phone. That was Will. They began to talk about how much they loved each other, and that today was going to be the beginning of their new life. Just before hanging up, I heard Will say, "Let me know. As soon as you've finished your work, I'll be near his house around 5 in the afternoon. Remember, make it look like a suicide," and hung up now. I had understood everything. They were planning to kill me. This only left me one option. I had to get ahead of their plan and finish them off. At that moment, I had a flash. When I saw Will leaving the restaurant that day, he took the direction to my house that it meant that he might come here to prepare part of his plan. I searched all over the house for some proof until I ended up in my room when I was a child. In the desk drawer, I found an envelope. When I opened it, there was a suicide note and a will with my false signature that left all my assets and my mother's to Angie. They wanted everything to seem like a consequence of my depression over my mother's death. At that moment, I remembered everything I had cried with Angel. Remembering Sonia and confessing to her how many times I had planned my suicide. But it was not time to get nostalgic. Time was running out, so I went straight to the store to buy some electrical tape and some cable ties. I went to my favorite restaurant to buy the sandwich that I always ate as a child. I ate it sitting down while keeping on spying on Angel's cell phone. I must confess that I was somewhat excited about what was going to happen. It was already 2 in the afternoon. I was returning home to prepare everything. I called Angel to come. To see me, he told me that at 5 he would arrive at my house. Remember the 9mm that he gave me, Benji? When we were young, I kept it all these years in the basement of my mother's house. I think it is the best situation to use it. Thanks again. Benji. I sat patiently waiting for 5 in the afternoon. The day was incredible, with a sun that came through the living room window and covered everything at 5. Angel came through the door. I pretended to be distressed and I confessed to him the death of my mother. His answer was one, "Wow, what a shame." There he finished signing his sentence. I took out my gun and pointed it at him. She started screaming and I had to use the tape to cover her mouth as quickly as I could. I tied her to a chair in my room and took her cell phone to warn Will. "I'm done. Can you come?" Not even 2 minutes passed, and Will came through the door. He went up the stairs, and there I was waiting for him with a bat. I hit his head and he fell to the ground. So there, I had the 2 monsters who planned to kill me, begging for their lives at that moment. I put my phone to record. I wanted them to confess before finishing with them. I told them that I knew all their plans, and that I knew everything that those children had done to them. I told them that I was going to commit suicide anyway, and that I didn't care about leaving them all my property. But they had to tell me what they did to those children and where they were keeping them. They agreed to confess. I suppose it was because of fear itself, believe me, even though they tried to see my face. Many times, I know how to make me respect their confession, left me frozen together. They had kidnapped and murdered 10 innocent children, and the bodies were in Will's country house, buried in the shed. Once I had the confession. Guess I fired the gun twice, a bullet for each of their heads. I was not going to allow those monsters to live one more second. A feeling of happiness ran through my body. I think fate did not want that I would have committed suicide when Sonia died, because I had to do this work right now. At 7 p.m. that day, I write this message like a god. I am ready to go and meet my parents and spend the rest of the days with Sonia. I hope that all who hear this story understand my actions. I am not a savior nor a hero, but I was not a villain either. I always tried to follow the straight path and be happy like everyone else. With this, I say goodbye. The last bullet of my gun will be for me. Thank you for listening.